The bell rang, its sharp tones slicing through the early morning hum of chatter in the hallway. Students shuffled into Miss Coleman's advanced history class, their footsteps blending into the muffled clamor. At the front of the room stood Miss Coleman herself, a rigid figure with a stern gaze, perfectly ironed blouse, and an air of unearned superiority. Her reputation preceded her. Known for her harshness, especially toward students of color, whispers about her thinly veiled biases circulated among the student body. But today, she wasn't prepared for who had walked into her classroom, Jamal Brooks, a brilliant and ambitious high school senior with dreams of studying law at an Ivy League school. As Jamal took his seat in the middle row, his presence alone seemed to unsettle Miss Coleman. She glanced at him, her lips pressing into a thin line as if calculating her next move. Without wasting a moment, Miss Coleman launched into her lecture, her tone dripping with condescension. "Let's begin," she said, her eyes darting briefly toward Jamal. "Today, we'll discuss the Revolutionary War, an era far removed from the narratives of victimhood some people cling to these days." Several students exchanged uncomfortable glances, some sinking deeper into their seats. Jamal sat upright, his sharp eyes locked on her, unflinching. The room's tension was palpable, and though the day had only begun, it was clear this would be no ordinary history lesson. Miss Coleman's lecture began as expected, her voice clipped and authoritative as she scrawled dates and events on the chalkboard, but it wasn't long before her true colors began to seep through. "Let's test how well you're paying attention," she said, turning abruptly to face the class. Her gaze landed squarely on Jamal, who was already jotting notes with practiced precision. "Jamal," she said, her tone sharp, "why don't you tell us why the Founding Fathers' vision of liberty didn't apply to everyone?" The question seemed straightforward, but her emphasis on everyone carried a pointed edge. A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the challenge beneath her words. Jamal, however, met her gaze without hesitation. "Certainly, Miss Coleman," he replied, his voice calm and steady. "The Founding Fathers' vision of liberty was limited by their own societal constructs, which excluded women, indigenous peoples, and enslaved Africans. Their pursuit of freedom was paradoxical, given their dependence on systems of oppression." The class murmured in quiet admiration, impressed by the clarity of his response. Miss Coleman, however, seemed less impressed. Her lips twitched as though she had tasted something bitter. She said, tapping her chalk against the desk. "A decent answer, but don't you think it's reductive to frame history through the lens of victimhood? Maybe if we spent less time dwelling on grievances, we could focus on what truly made this country great." The words hung in the air like a cloud of smoke, choking the room with their implications. A few students widened their eyes in shock, while others stared at their desks, unwilling to meet anyone's gaze. Jamal's jaw tightened, but he remained composed. "I don't believe acknowledging the truth is dwelling on grievances, Miss Coleman," Jamal replied, his tone unshaken. "Understanding the full context of history is essential if we're to appreciate the progress we've made and recognize where we still need to grow." Her face darkened, and for a moment it seemed she might lash out. But instead, she turned back to the board with a dismissive wave of her hand. "Let's move on," she said curtly, though the tension in the room lingered. The class trudged on, but the atmosphere was thick with unease. Miss Coleman, though outwardly calm, began to orchestrate subtle digs aimed squarely at Jamal. Each question she posed seemed tailored to challenge him, each comment laced with veiled disdain. "Jamal," she called out again, this time after detailing the economic underpinnings of the American colonies. "Can you explain why the Southern economy relied so heavily on certain labor systems?" Her tone dripped with implication, the emphasis on labor systems leaving no room for misinterpretation. Jamal leaned back slightly, aware of her intentions, but refusing to be rattled. "The Southern economy was deeply reliant on enslaved labor," he said, enunciating each word deliberately, "because it allowed plantation owners to amass wealth on the backs of unpaid workers. This exploitation was a cornerstone of the economy, and one of the reasons systemic inequities persist even today." There was no mistaking the ripple of tension that moved through the room. A few students glanced at each other, some impressed by Jamal's poise, others nervously waiting for Miss Coleman's reaction. Her smile was thin, almost brittle. "That's one perspective," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "But perhaps it's time we focus on the resilience and ingenuity of the colonists rather than perpetuating a narrative of oppression." Jamal's pen hovered over his notebook, his fingers tightening around it. He could see what she was doing, trying to bait him to diminish his voice, but he wouldn't give her the satisfaction of losing his cool. "History isn't about comfort, Miss Coleman," he said, his tone measured but firm. "It's about truth. Ignoring the darker parts doesn't make them disappear. It just ensures we'll repeat them." A few students nodded subtly, their silent support emboldening him, but Miss Coleman, visibly unsettled, pressed on. "Perhaps we'll come back to that idea later," she said abruptly, turning back to the chalkboard. "For now, let's focus on the achievements that define this era." It was a clear attempt to shift the narrative, to reassert her control over the discussion, but Jamal wasn't done yet. He knew she wouldn't stop until she felt she'd silenced him completely. As the class continued, Miss Coleman's attempts to undermine Jamal became more overt. She began to frame her questions in ways designed to corner him, subtly questioning his intelligence in front of the class. "Jamal," she said again, this time after discussing the framing of the Constitution, "you seem to have strong opinions about historical injustices. So tell me, what do you think about the 3/5 compromise? Do you believe the Founding Fathers were all just racist villains?" Her question was a trap, framed to provoke an emotional response or force him into an oversimplified answer. The class went silent, all eyes on Jamal as he considered his response. "That's an interesting question, Miss Coleman," Jamal began, his voice calm but firm. The 3/5 compromise was a calculated political move, one that highlights the moral contradictions of the time. It wasn't about seeing black people as partial humans. It was about using their presence to bolster representation while denying them actual rights. To call them racist villains would be reductive. They were flawed individuals navigating a flawed system. But understanding their actions requires us to critically examine their motives, not gloss over them for the sake of comfort. The class was riveted. Jamal's response was eloquent, precise, and impossible to dismiss. But Miss Coleman, rather than acknowledging his insight, gave a tight smile. "That's an opinion," she said curtly, "though I would argue that we shouldn't project modern sensibilities onto historical figures. It's unfair to judge them by today's standards." Jamal's eyebrows lifted slightly, but he stayed composed. "I'm not projecting, Miss Coleman," he replied. "I'm simply analyzing their actions in the context of their time while recognizing their impact on today's society. History doesn't exist in a vacuum." The air in the room grew heavier. A few students, emboldened by Jamal's courage, nodded subtly or exchanged approving glances, but Miss Coleman's irritation was becoming harder to mask. "Well," she said, her voice tight, "perhaps if we spent less time moralizing and more time appreciating the challenges they faced, we'd understand history better." Jamal leaned forward slightly, his eyes steady. "Appreciation doesn't require ignoring the truth," he said. "If we can't confront the contradictions in our history, how can we truly learn from it?" Miss Coleman's face flushed, her grip on the chalk tightening. It was clear she wasn't used to being challenged this way, especially not by a student. The class trudged on, but the tension had reached a boiling point. Miss Coleman, visibly agitated, began steering the lecture in a new direction, one that felt oddly personal. She started referencing events and figures in ways that seemed designed to target Jamal's identity and beliefs. "Let's talk about cultural contributions to history," she announced, her tone sharp and clipped. Some groups, despite facing hardships, still managed to contribute positively to society. Take Booker T. Washington, for example, a man who focused on self-reliance and hard work, rather than dwelling on oppression. She didn't look at Jamal as she spoke, but her words were clearly aimed at him. The subtle dig was obvious to everyone in the room. Jamal, however, remained calm, his pen moving steadily across his notebook as though her words couldn't touch him. "Jamal," she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the silence, "do you agree with Washington's philosophy, or do you think he should have focused more on grievances?" This time, there was no mistaking her intent. A few students exchanged uneasy glances, their discomfort palpable. Jamal paused, setting his pen down carefully before meeting her gaze. "I think Booker T. Washington's contributions were significant," Jamal said evenly, "but they were part of a larger debate within the black community. While Washington emphasized self-reliance, others like W.E.B. Du Bois argued for political activism and civil rights. Both approaches were necessary for progress, and dismissing one as mere grievance oversimplifies the struggle for equality. His response was met with an audible murmur of approval from the class, but Miss Coleman wasn't ready to let it go. "Interesting," she said, her voice laced with sarcasm, "but don't you think focusing too much on activism can create division rather than unity?" Perhaps that's why Washington's approach was more productive. Jamal's jaw tightened, but his expression remained composed. "Respectfully, Miss Coleman," he said, his voice steady, "Washington's approach worked in his context, but activism is what drives systemic change. Without it, many of the rights we take for granted today wouldn't exist. Unity is important, but it shouldn't come at the cost of justice." The class was silent, the weight of Jamal's words hanging in the air. Miss Coleman's face reddened, and her smile grew tight. "Well," she said briskly, "perhaps you should consider that there are different perspectives on these issues. Not everything has to be about race, after all." The comment landed like a slap. A few students gasped softly, their shock evident. Jamal's expression didn't falter, but something shifted in his eyes, resolve hardening into steel. The room was suffocatingly silent after Miss Coleman's comment, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. Even those who had been quiet spectators now looked visibly uncomfortable. Jamal, however, remained composed. He let the silence linger, his calm demeanor magnifying the tension in the room. "Miss Coleman," he said finally, his voice steady but firm, "I find it curious that you'd suggest race doesn't need to be a factor in discussions about history. How do we address the truth of what happened without acknowledging the systems and prejudices that shaped it?" His words were sharp, but his tone was respectful, a balance that made it impossible to accuse him of being confrontational. Miss Coleman blinked, caught off guard by his calm defiance. "I'm just saying," she replied, her voice tinged with irritation, "that constantly framing discussions around race can detract from the broader lessons of history. Sometimes focusing on unity rather than division might be more productive." Jamal tilted his head slightly, as if considering her words. "Productive for whom?" he asked. The question was simple, but its implications were anything but. A ripple of murmurs moved through the class. For the first time, several students began to shift in their seats, nodding in agreement with Jamal or casting skeptical glances at Miss Coleman. "History isn't divisive, Miss Coleman," Jamal continued. "It's only divisive when we refuse to tell the whole story. Unity doesn't come from ignoring the truth. It comes from confronting it and working toward understanding." A hand shot up from the back of the room. It was Elena, one of Jamal's classmates, who rarely spoke in class. "Jamal's right," she said, her voice hesitant but growing stronger. "If we don't talk about what really happened, how are we supposed to learn? Ignoring stuff like racism doesn't make it go away." Another hand went up, then another. One by one, students began voicing their agreement, emboldened by Jamal's courage. Miss Coleman's eyes darted around the room, her carefully constructed authority beginning to crumble. "All right," she said sharply, trying to regain control. "Let's move on to the next topic." But the class wasn't ready to move on. Jamal had ignited something, a shift in the dynamic that Miss Coleman couldn't ignore. "Actually, Miss Coleman," Jamal said, his voice unwavering, "I think this discussion is important. If we're going to understand history, we need to include all perspectives, not just the ones that make us comfortable." The class murmured in agreement, and Miss Coleman's face flushed with frustration. She looked as though she wanted to argue, but couldn't find the words. Miss Coleman's authority was slipping, and she could feel it. The murmurs of agreement among the students weren't just unsettling, they were a direct challenge to her control over the classroom. She straightened her posture, gripping a piece of chalk so tightly it looked as though it might snap. "That's enough," she said, her voice sharp and cutting. The students fell quiet, but the energy in the room was still charged. Her gaze zeroed in on Jamal, as if he alone were responsible for the dissent. "Jamal," she said, her tone laced with thinly veiled irritation, "since you seem to have all the answers, why don't you tell us how you would teach this class? Clearly, you have strong opinions about how history should be presented." There was a sneer in her voice, as though she expected to humiliate him, but Jamal didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, meeting her gaze with calm resolve. "Gladly," he replied, his voice steady and confident. "I'd start by acknowledging that history isn't just a series of dates and events. It's the story of people, complex, flawed, and diverse. I'd make sure every perspective was included, even the uncomfortable ones. because that's the only way to truly understand the past and its impact on the present. The class erupted into murmurs of approval, and a few students even clapped softly. Miss Coleman's face flushed, her composure cracking under the weight of her mounting frustration. "That's easy to say," she snapped, "but teaching requires more than just lofty ideals. It requires discipline and objectivity, something you clearly lack." The room went silent again, the insult hanging in the air like a slap. Jamal's expression remained neutral, but the flicker of hurt in his eyes was unmistakable. For a moment, it seemed like Miss Coleman might have succeeded in cutting him down. But then Jamal spoke, his voice calm and measured. "Objectivity doesn't mean ignoring the truth, Miss Coleman. It means presenting all the facts, even the ones that make us uncomfortable. Isn't that what education is supposed to be about?" The class murmured in agreement once more, and Miss Coleman's frustration turned to outright anger. "That's enough," she said again, her voice rising slightly. "This is my classroom, and I won't have you undermining my authority." Jamal leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "I'm not trying to undermine you, Miss Coleman," he said. "I'm just trying to make sure the truth gets heard." The tension in the room was almost unbearable, and for a moment no one moved. Miss Coleman was visibly flustered, her authority unraveling before the class. Miss Coleman's frustration was palpable, her usually composed demeanor now a faint shadow of itself. The classroom, however, had shifted in Jamal's favor. Students were no longer silent spectators. They were engaged, attentive, and clearly aligned with the young man who had fearlessly stood up to her. But Miss Coleman wasn't finished. In a desperate attempt to reassert her authority, she slammed her chalk down onto the desk. The sharp crack startled the room into silence. "Enough of this," she snapped. "If you think you're so well informed, Jamal, let's see how much you really know. I'll give you the floor." Her words were dripping with condescension, her intent clear. She expected him to falter under the pressure of being put on the spot. Jamal, however, didn't hesitate. He rose from his seat with quiet confidence, the murmurs of his classmates fading as they turned their attention to him. "Thank you, Miss Coleman," he said, his voice calm but commanding. He walked to the front of the room, standing where Miss Coleman had moments before. Her presence loomed nearby, arms crossed and lips pressed into a thin line, but Jamal paid her no mind. "Let's talk about the Reconstruction era," Jamal began, his tone steady. "It's a period often overshadowed in history lessons, yet it's crucial to understanding the systemic issues we face today." He began outlining key events and figures with precision, drawing connections between the past and the present that left the class visibly impressed. His passion for history was evident, but what truly captivated his peers was his ability to make the subject come alive, weaving it into a narrative that was both compelling and relevant. "What we see," he continued, "is that progress isn't linear. It's filled with setbacks, resistance, and sometimes willful ignorance. But if we don't confront these moments, if we refuse to learn from them, we're doomed to repeat them." A few students nodded, their eyes fixed on Jamal. Even those who had been disengaged at the start of class were now hanging on his every word. Miss Coleman, however, was growing visibly agitated. "That's enough," she said sharply, stepping forward to reclaim her position. "You've made your point, Jamal." But Jamal didn't budge. He turned to face her, his expression calm but firm. "Actually, Miss Coleman, I don't think I have," he said, "because the point isn't about me or you. It's about making sure everyone in this room understands the full story, not just the sanitized version." The room went still. For a moment it seemed as though Miss Coleman might explode, but before she could respond, another student raised their hand. "Can Jamal keep going?" Elena asked, her voice steady. "I feel like I'm learning more from him than I have all year." Other students chimed in, echoing Elena's sentiment. Miss Coleman looked around the room, her face a mixture of anger and disbelief. Her authority wasn't just slipping, it was crumbling entirely. Miss Coleman's face flushed a deep crimson as the murmurs of approval for Jamal spread throughout the classroom. She looked around, searching for a foothold, but found none. The students weren't just silently observing anymore, they were actively supporting Jamal. Her control over the room had all but evaporated, leaving her with only one option, a desperate attempt to reassert her authority. "All right, that's enough," she barked, her voice sharp and commanding. She stepped forward, forcing Jamal to take a step back from the front of the room. "This is my classroom, and I will not allow anyone, student or otherwise, to hijack my lesson plan." Jamal didn't react with anger or frustration. Instead, he stepped back with grace, nodding slightly. "Of course, Miss Coleman." "It is your classroom," he said, his tone respectful but firm. "But as a student, I have a right to question what I'm being taught and how it's being taught." The room fell silent again, the air thick with tension. Miss Coleman's chest heaved slightly as she struggled to maintain composure. "If you have concerns," she said, her voice low and icy, "you can take them up with the administration. But for now, you'll sit down and let me teach." Jamal returned to his seat without protest, his calm demeanor starkly contrasting with Miss Coleman's flustered state. But the damage to her authority had already been done. As Miss Coleman turned back to the board, her hand trembling slightly as she picked up a piece of chalk, Elena raised her hand again. "Miss Coleman," she said, her voice steady, "I think Jamal's right. We need to learn the whole story, not just the parts that are comfortable. And honestly, it feels like you're shutting him down because he's challenging you." A ripple of agreement moved through the room, and other students began voicing their thoughts. "Yeah," said Miguel, another student who rarely spoke. "It's like every time Jamal says something, you act like he's doing something wrong, but he's just asking for the truth." "I feel the same way," added Jasmine from the back row. "Why is it a problem to talk about all sides of history?" Miss Coleman's eyes darted around the room, her authority slipping further with each passing moment. The students weren't just questioning her, they were actively siding with Jamal, demanding more than what she was willing to provide. Finally, in a moment of desperation, she lashed out. "If you think you know so much, maybe you'd all prefer Jamal teach this class," she snapped, her voice shaking. Jamal didn't miss a beat. He stood up again, his calm demeanor unwavering. "I don't want to teach, Miss Coleman," he said. "I just want to make sure we're learning the truth. Isn't that the point of education?" The class erupted into applause, their support for Jamal resounding. Miss Coleman's face turned an even deeper shade of red, but she said nothing. For the first time, she seemed truly at a loss. The next day, the events of Miss Coleman's class had already spread like wildfire through the school. Students whispered in hallways, and even teachers seemed to be talking about the confrontation. By lunchtime, it was clear that the administration had gotten wind of what had happened. Jamal was called to the principal's office, but he walked in with the same calm confidence he had displayed in class. Principal Andrews, a seasoned educator known for his fairness, greeted him with a serious but not unkind expression. "Jamal," he began, gesturing for him to sit, "I've heard quite a bit about what happened in Miss Coleman's class yesterday. Would you like to share your perspective?" Jamal recounted the events with clarity, carefully detailing how Miss Coleman's dismissive comments had escalated, and how he had chosen to respond. He emphasized that his goal had never been to disrupt the class, but to advocate for an honest and inclusive discussion of history. Principal Andrews listened intently, nodding occasionally. When Jamal finished, he leaned back in his chair, letting out a thoughtful sigh. "I appreciate your candor, Jamal," he said, "and I admire the way you handled yourself. I'll be speaking with Miss Coleman about her conduct. This school prides itself on fostering open, respectful dialogue, and it sounds like that standard wasn't upheld yesterday." Jamal nodded, feeling a sense of validation but knowing the matter wasn't entirely over. "Thank you, sir," he said. "I just want to make sure all students feel like their voices matter, like we're being taught the whole truth, not just parts of it." Later that week, Miss Coleman returned to class, but something had changed. She seemed subdued, her usual sharpness dulled by what appeared to be a forced humility. The principal's intervention had clearly left an impression. At the start of class, she stood at the front of the room, holding a stack of papers. "Before we begin today," she said, her voice measured, "I'd like to acknowledge that our discussion earlier this week may not have been as constructive as it could have been. As educators, it's our responsibility to ensure that all perspectives are heard and respected. Moving forward, I'll be working to make this classroom a space for open and honest dialogue." The class was stunned. It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was a step in the right direction. Jamal exchanged a glance with Elena, who gave him a small, approving nod. For the rest of the year, Miss Coleman was noticeably more careful in her approach to teaching. She began including more diverse perspectives in her lessons, and her once dismissive tone softened. As for Jamal, his courage and eloquence became a source of inspiration for his peers. By the end of the year, he had been accepted into his dream school, a prestigious Ivy League university. where he planned to study law and continue advocating for truth and justice.